Hello, everyone. Friends of Fire, welcome to our third discussion in the four-part Fueling Collaboration panel discussion series. We're so glad that so many folks are able to join us today. So thank you very much for taking time out of your day to join us. My name is Andrea Brandon, and I am the Science Delivery Specialist for the Northern Research Station. The Northern Research Station, along with the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists, the Lake States Fire Science Consortium, North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, Oak Woodlands and Forest Fire Consortium, and the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savanna Fire Science Consortium are all happy to be co-presenting this discussion. So I just wanted to quickly also acknowledge our organizers for today, Amanda Mahaffey, Joe Marshall, Jack McGowan-Stinsky, myself, Jen Bunty, and Craig Meyer. These folks have all worked together to organize this panel discussion. So our goal in Fueling Collaboration, this series, is to bring together researchers and land managers to learn about and to discuss the latest in fire science and application, and to build collaborative opportunities across the region. Today's discussion will focus on fire and climate change, and Jen Bunty will be our moderator, and we have an excellent lineup of panelists. Just as a quick note, Jack McGowan-Stinsky and I will be moderating the chat box, the chat window, so please ask your questions. We want you to be actively engaged in this discussion. And I guess without further ado, I will kick it off to Jen so that she can talk a little bit more on our topic of the day and introduce our panelists and get us going. So Jen, take it away.
Great, thank you, Andrea, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us, for all of your thoughtful questions when you registered, and thank you to our panelists for being here. So I should start by saying, so I'm the Public Information Coordinator for the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists. So I work in science delivery, but my background's in population ecology. And I want to start by sharing Casey Thornborough's apologies. He wasn't able to join us today. He was one of our planned panelists, but due to a family emergency, he got pulled away. So we're all gonna send good thoughts his way, and I'm gonna work out with him on figuring out another way that he can connect with our audience here on these topics. But we have a great panel still, and I'm so excited for this discussion. Before I introduce our panelists, I wanna go over just a couple of quick sort of ground rules where we're starting out with on this. As Andrea said, we will be taking questions via the chat box. We're going to focus on the questions that we got through registration first, and then we'll be taking questions later on in our time block here today, if we can, from the chat box. So please just post them as they come to you, and we have some people sorting through them that they'll pop in and ask them when that time comes. We'll have all the audience turn off their cameras and mute themselves, so it's just the panelists. That keeps the bandwidth down because we do have a pretty large audience today, and it lets you focus on the people who we're all here to hear from. This discussion is going to be primarily based, hopefully, on scientific reasoning and evidence and research, and we're going to attempt, and we ask all of the participants, especially if there's side chats going on, to maintain the collaborative spirit. We know climate change can be a hot issue. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Climate change can be a hot issue. So we're gonna, again, maintain that collaborative spirit, keep on science-based reasoning, and we're gonna spend this time just sharing resources, stories from our work, and discuss, potential issues that might be coming up, and maybe even some solutions under current climate change prediction models. We acknowledge that these models are not perfect or definite in any way, and that climate change is expected to affect us all differently, right? Based on our region, what ecosystem we're working in, vegetation type, even our socioeconomic groups. So we're gonna lay that down as a premise, right? These are based on models, they affect us all differently from all different levels, from local forest all the way up to the country and the globe. We're not going to solve it all today, guys. So I just want to start with that, but we are going to have a lively discussion, and we're gonna start chipping away at it. So unless there are major objections, panelists, I'd like to dive in, and I'd like to have you guys introduce yourselves, to just give your name, your title, organization, who you work for, sort of maybe describe the region that you work in, because a lot of us aren't based necessarily in our regions right now. And as I sort of touched on in my introduction, the topic of fire and climate change, it just has so many different facets. We're seeing different effects at all levels. And so I'd like you to just describe what area you're working in terms of climate change, or how your work is adapting in the face of climate change. And I'd like to start with Leslie, if that's okay. Leslie?
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Leslie Brandt. I am a climate change specialist with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and the USDA Forest Service. I work for the Eastern Region and Northern Research Station of the Forest Service, and I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota. The work that I do focuses across our whole region, from Minnesota, Missouri, Maryland, and Maine, that whole region, but I've specialized in a few specific areas. About 5 years ago, we completed a climate change vulnerability assessment for the Central Hardwoods region, focusing on Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. And then I've been doing a lot of work in urban areas. We completed a vulnerability assessment for the Chicago region, and now we're doing some work with Rhode Island and with Detroit. And then I've also done some work outside of our region. So I did some work with Austin, Texas this past couple of years, as well as some work with the Southwest Fire Climb group that has been developing a climate change adaptation menu for fire management. So I'd say my interests are pretty broad and wide, and all of my work really focuses on trying to understand the impacts of climate change on our forests and what we can do to adapt to those changes. And that includes fire, but also a number of other considerations.
Thank you. Yeah, so you have that more broad scale view, which is going to be really, really helpful, I think, today. Will, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I'm Will Flatley, and I'm an assistant professor in the geography department at the University of Central Arkansas. And I'm a biogeographer, forest ecologist, fire ecologist. And I do research. Well, so the areas that I've worked in, I've done a fair amount of fire history and forest succession, stand dynamics, response to disturbance in the Southern Appalachians, and then recently in the interior highlands, so in the Ouachita Mountains and the Ozark Plateau. And I've used tree rings primarily for that work to reconstruct historical processes. How that's changed in terms of climate change, I think that's maybe something interesting that we could discuss is with climate projections, how do we think about HRV, historical conditions, and how do they inform our management under future climate? And then the other piece that I've done is, or another focus of research, is working in the Southwest and now expanding into the Rockies up to Wyoming, and doing landscape simulation modeling to look at, to essentially simulate forest change under different climate projections, look at how that's going to interact with disturbance, fire, and then also trying to, we've had a focus of trying to incorporate management into the simulation modeling in order to test different approaches under different climate projections. And as part of that, Leslie mentioned the Fire Climb project. I worked on that, which was in the Southwest. But I think a lot of what we did for that project is applicable to other regions. I'll talk about, when we talk about resources, some of the products that we produce, but the idea behind that was to take models and other sort of tools, and engage with the management community, and again, try and start to develop discussion, thinking, and developing different management approaches designed to have better outcomes under different climate scenarios.
Great, great. Yeah, we are definitely coming back to management, and that fire history component I know is going to be a big piece because we almost have to look back to look forward sometimes. So, Erin, you go next, please.
Hi, I am Erin Lane. I work for the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station. And in that position, I'm lucky enough to work for two organizations, one climate focused and one fire focused, the USDA Northeast Climate Hub, and then also the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, both of which I've been with since their beginnings. My focus is on how climate is changing specific to the Northeast, and we define the Northeast a little bit more north and a little bit more east than Leslie's. So just the most northeastern 13 states. And in the North Atlantic Exchange, it's actually, as most of you probably know, there's more of a ecotone delineation than it is state boundaries. Through my work, I really study how climate change is impacting our region and how it's impacting each agricultural and forestry sector all along the supply chains, and how we adapt to the changes, and also how we can use our working lands to mitigate climate change as well. And my fire ecology and planning experience is really mostly focused on northern New England, so even further north and east.
I like how you're like boxing yourself in. We know that you you have information about other places, Erin. Don't try. And all right, last but not least, Rob, would you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Rob Klein. I'm a fire ecologist for the National Park Service. I am based at Great Smoky Mountains National Park in East Tennessee, but I work for a 5-state fire management zone that incorporates North and South Carolina, parks in North and South Carolina, parts of Virginia, East Tennessee, and Northern Georgia. So I think I represent the southern component of this group today that we'll be talking about. My work involves mostly long-term fire effects monitoring. We look at a lot, the effects of prescribed burn efforts and wildfires as well over the long term. I'm also pretty heavily involved in fire planning for the units within our zone. And I'm also involved pretty heavily in operations. So I think I'm also represent a little bit more of the management side of this group as well. And both do a lot of prescribed burning and wildfire management as well. So as you know, as such, I don't work with climate change specifically directly. I am more of one of the people that tries to grapple with the science and what the emerging information that comes out to try to develop better planning and better predictions that relate to preparedness or long-term fire management objectives, ecological objectives, things like that. So I'm trying to stay up with the knowledge as it emerges and figure out how we translate that into our management actions. So I think that's what I bring to this discussion, is that side of things. I represent that management side that is struggling with how do we use this information. So, I think just to close that out, I would just emphasize that I'm not an expert on climate change. I think I'm like a lot of people that are probably on this call or that are listening to this today. I'm trying to understand the effects of climate change and where that should be leading us as we try to figure out how to adapt our fire planning and preparedness and things like that.
Yeah, and thank you for that. Thank you for highlighting that aspect of it, especially because, the title of the series is Fueling Collaboration. And when we first set out designing this series, we were thinking about the collaboration between researchers and managers, which is a big part of what the Northern Research Station does. And it's also a big part of what the Fire Science Exchange Network and all the consortiums do. And actually, since we're on that, I'd like to start by talking about management, because we do have a lot of people who registered are what we would classify as land managers. And so I'd like to just pull apart how we're going to incorporate climate change planning, risks, effects into management practice. And feel free to jump in on this, anyone. I'm just going to open it up to all four of you. How can we plan for management? How can we use information from fire history and climate predictions? Does it throw all of our planning out of the window? Should it throw all of our planning out the window? Should we adjust everything? Should we adjust small things? Feel free to jump in.
I can start with that, and then others can jump in from there. What we've been doing a lot in our group for a variety of climate change adaptation questions is starting with your existing goals and objectives for the land that you're managing. So thinking about what your values are already and what you're trying to achieve on the landscape, and then adding in.
Sorry, Lizzie, I think you got muted somehow.
Okay. I don't know how that happened. I did not mute myself. So then adding in a climate filter on top of what you're already considering. And by examining what might be vulnerable to climate change, either by looking at historical changes on your landscape using observational data, or by using projections under a range of future conditions, then you can start to think about whether you need to adjust your goals and objectives, or you can continue to meet those with some small adaptations, or those could be really small tweaks, or it could be larger things depending on the scale of the impacts you're anticipating on your location. And so I think having a structured process for going through and thinking about this is the first step to making sure that you're not just throwing everything that you've already done out the window, but rather building on what you've been doing for so long and all the knowledge that you already have, but just adding in this additional layer and thought process.
And I could jump in with some comments about the, so thinking about historical conditions, historical fire regimes, and forest conditions. And so I think that those are, so, you know, what you may be able to manage for in the future could potentially change. It may not. I think, you know, there's going to be an enormous amount of variability. But that information is still important in terms of, I think, informing management. And one is just looking at how forests have responded to changes in the disturbance regime in the past. And so that's one thing that I think about a lot, is that fire regimes have been really dynamic, particularly like in the eastern US for many centuries. You know, one being just in the last century of fire suppression, right? Forests have changed, just fire regimes have changed greatly, right? Fire has declined and forests have responded. In the past, there's evidence that there have been, whether you call them a fire wave or increases in burning when Euro-Americans arrived, and then, you know, intensive industrial disturbances. And so forests have responded to a lot of change, and understanding how they did in the past. And, you know, recognize there's a lot of capacity for resilience. And then, you know, like if you were to think about a reference condition, an HRV, then that may not apply necessarily to your specific landscape, but it's potentially going to apply to other landscapes if they are changing into that window of climate. And it may not apply across your whole landscape, but pieces, right? So, there are moister, drier components of the landscape, areas that are more likely to burn. And so I think that there's still a lot of information from the historical record. And I guess also sort of what Leslie was saying, not throwing everything out, but this in places it may be rapid, it may be more gradual, but sort of starting from that base and then potentially tweaking. And I think a lot about experimentation, like on kind of smaller scales, and trying and observing things. And because you're not going to get a projection that shows you exactly what's going to happen in your landscape with, however good we may describe a model in a publication, or just climate projections. How much we emit could drastically alter how much greenhouse gases we emit, could drastically alter the direction that we head in terms of warming. So I think variability thinking, and maybe trying some little things, and definitely observing what's happening in the landscape.
Now, when you are talking about trying little things and experimenting on the landscape, are you talking about long-term experiments over years and decades, or are there things that people can do within maybe a few seasons or a couple of years?
I think that both, but probably on the shorter scale are the more helpful things, and whether that's doing some just like doing a little bit of planting to see what will grow in different environmental conditions in your landscape. If you can, do that, or in a controlled situation, or, burning, experimenting, if possible, a little bit with burning in different seasons, or, burning at different intensity levels. I guess that kind of thing seems more useful than setting up an experiment that's going to run for 20 or 30 years and waiting to see what happens.
Great, thank you for that. So Will and Leslie, you both mentioned just sort of adding in this layer of climate change, or this aspect of climate change, into the management plans we have already. And so I'm wondering if any of you have advice for someone, say they're starting from square one, they have not considered climate change yet. I think there are a lot of people like that out there doing management plans, because they already have so much on their plate, so many variables that they're considering, right? So if they're starting from square one, where do they start? And I'm kind of hoping, Rob, that you'll jump in and talk a little bit about your experience with your planning process.
Yeah, I can try to address that. I think, with the, going back a little bit to what they were talking about, what Will was hitting on is, I think in the past we've really looked at, and this is a big change that's occurred during my career. We've seen that, we've looked at the historical vegetation, and that we've always kind of said we want to restore, the system back to what it was pre-European settlement or something like that, pre-Columbian. And I think that model is definitely shifting. And so where we have to use that as a baseline for what we want to try to preserve on the landscape, or maybe what is a reference condition. But as Will was saying, we also need to incorporate what the models are telling us for what the projected changes might be. And then we can use that. It doesn't mean I agree with Will. We don't throw out that historical information. It's vital to have that because it tells us how species respond, and that can help us predict how things might, how these same species that are still on our landscape might respond under the new conditions that we see being modeled in the research. And so to go to the planning part of it, to be honest, I don't think we've really been able to incorporate all of that yet. You mentioned the large number of variables that we have, and I think we really struggle to just do basic adequate planning for preparedness for wildfires, and just to get projects done, essentially, to meet fundamental objectives of fuel reduction and things like that. But I think what folks can do as they're approaching planning at the early stages is definitely, you know, I think you start by looking at the past. You know, you look at what was historically, what you know about the fire history, what you know about the maybe the pre-settlement vegetation. And there's a lot of data sources for that at this point in time. And then you have to look at presently, what do you have? What do you currently have on the landscape now? Because it may be that things have changed so much that some historical condition is very difficult to achieve. And then the third piece of that, of course, is the future. What are the models telling us that we can expect? And we don't. The challenge there is that we don't have that site-specific information, I think, which is what we all need. Talking to a lot of managers, park managers, fire managers, that's what everybody is really struggling with, is that lack of site-specific information. But I think if we just take general knowledge of what, you know, we know that we have increased in temperatures. We know how that affects things like evapotranspiration and forest pests and things like that. So we can start to imagine and predict what some of the changes might be. And then we got to put all those three things together. That's the hard part. And I think that's trying not to figure everything out is a key part of trying to start a new planning process, I think, and just starting to acknowledge and be comfortable with the uncertainty, I think, is something that we have to be able to sit with.
I'll just jump in here a little bit too on the National Forest System side. We've been working with a lot of groups on integrating climate change considerations into NEPA projects. And then we've also been working with the Wayne National Forest on their land management plan assessment and their elements of their plan to integrate climate change. And I think groups like ours at the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science are available to help managers think through these things. So you don't have to necessarily do it on your own. There are people out there available who have all of the tools and knowledge and have a process already laid out for thinking through these things. So reach out to me, reach out to my colleagues, and we're here to assist in that process.
And Erin, did I see you? Did you want to jump in as well on this?
Sure. I think the future is important, but I also think you can start with right now and how climate has already and it's happening now. You don't have to look very far in the future to see that. And looking at what's happening at your spot on the globe, because depending on where you are, the climate is changing very differently, and honing in on what's happening in your state can be a good starting point. I suggest NOAA state summaries, which is a really straightforward, condensed version of what's happening in your state, and then taking a look at those graphs, finding out exactly is it more precipitation, what season is the precipitation increasing in, how are those minimum temperatures changing, and that can really help you get a good sense of where to start.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I actually just wanted to throw in, I know an FMO, a fire management officer here, someone who plans for controlled burns and firefighting in our region, who says, you know, I know on this end of my forest it's supposed to get hotter and drier, and I know on this end of my forest it's supposed to get cooler and wetter, and so he kind of just takes these like sort of take home points for himself to incorporate into his planning. And I guess we'll see how effective it is after a few decades. But Will, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say on some of what you all touched on about manager frustration with not having site-specific projections or information. And I think, like, from a modeling perspective, you know, I understand that. I mean, you know, I've done modeling in a couple different landscapes. But I think one way to look at it is that really, again, with these projections with outcomes for forests and management approaches, we're talking about really kind of a broad range. And that's the best way to look at things that, they're sort of like, I don't know about guardrails, but like a wide range of future outcomes. And so knowing that, you can take a study from another landscape that is in a similar region, or you could even look at stuff going from the east to the west and just take away points from that of, in a drier landscape, fuels may limit fire in some instances, something like that. And so I think that that's a way that you can draw in stuff that's not specific to your particular site, but that might provide some really good information. And then from there, as Leslie was mentioning, this the climate adaptation menu or workbook, and that's really, again, talking with managers and then coming up with some different possible steps. And Leslie, if you want to talk about it more, but it's just based on people's understanding of their landscape, not on models or plots, but these are some things that we might see that we might, in ways that we could approach this in building a menu, so that then you can start to think about and do the planning and making choices for your individual landscape.
Yeah, a little bit more about the adaptation menu for fire. This was something that was modeled after, and by model, I just mean like as an example, not like a mathematical model. Modeled after some of the other adaptation menus we developed for forestry and wildlife and a variety of other resources. And it's meant to be sort of a brainstorming tool for managers to think about, okay, these are the impacts that I'm seeing or I'm expecting to see. These are some potential steps I could take. And here are some examples of how other people have been implementing this on the ground. And it's not meant to be prescriptive, but rather to just give you a starting point for talking about it. And what we've seen is that a lot of times people realize you're already doing adaptation. You're just not labeling that way. And so we're also giving you some tools for thinking about what you're already doing in a different context.
Great, thank you for that. And I just want to highlight there's some resources being shared in the chat, and we will be linking these resources with the recording of this video on the Northern Research Station Fueling Collaboration site in a few weeks whenever we get the recording processed. I also saw a comment out of the corner of my eye from Michelle, who said she's done a lot of trainings thinking on climate change as a land manager, and she cannot recommend highly enough these tools. Super approachable for anyone and provides really solid and supportable results, which is just great feedback. And thank you for sharing that personal experience, Michelle. So I want to focus in a little bit on controlled burning or prescribed fire, whichever term you prefer. Under the conditions that we are expecting with climate change, with concerns about carbon release or carbon sequestration, should we be burning? How does it affect these things? What evidence is out there? Where can we get some information on how controlled burning fits into this picture of climate change? And I'll leave it open to anyone that wants to jump in.
So I have a little understanding of this, and others can add to it, but there are emissions that occur from any burning material. There have been some studies that show that generally wildfires emit much more than prescribed fires. And long-term understanding is that both for carbon dioxide and the renewal of biomass, which of course sequesters carbon, prescribed fires in the long run are beneficial to the situation because they prevent larger wildfires and because of the regrowth that happens after the prescribed fire.
Yeah, I'll jump in and talk about this just a little bit. I think with we have a couple of issues with prescribed burning. One of them is that we have this, other issue out here that's the fuels problem, the narrative that we've developed, and the reality that we face throughout a lot of the country of having issues with fuel buildup or fuel growth, especially in places that are problematic because of the wildland-urban interface and things like that. So I think as managers, we have a responsibility to deal with those issues. Prescribed burning has been an incredibly indispensable tool for dealing with that. And also the issues related to ecological restoration and maintenance of especially important in the National Park Service, as our mission is to maintain the species that were on the landscape when those parks were created. And we can't do that without fire in a lot of cases. So those are two big reasons why, I think it's important to be able to continue to do that. But I think we do have a responsibility as well to consider what the impacts are going forward, though, and maybe incorporate that into some of our planning. Jumping on what Aaron said, it's also my understanding that in the long run, that's a net benefit. And I suppose it probably depends on how you're burning and how large those burns are, how frequent they are, and things like that. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Will, go ahead.
So yeah, I think adding to that, and I agree that I think it has to be a consideration of human health and emissions. But two things thinking about the like ecology, that burning is promoting is generally going to promote xeric and fire tolerant species on the landscape. And generally, the projections of warmer temperatures, precipitation's harder to confidently project, but there may be more droughts. But so the likelihood is that those species are going to be better adapted. Xerophytic, fire-tolerant species may be better adapted to future conditions. And if we think about, and I know that probably everybody's familiar with this, but in the last 100 years, things have shifted towards that mesophytic, fire-intolerant side of the spectrum. And so we're really far away from the direction that we're probably going to eventually go, potentially. And so moving it back towards that puts more species on the landscape that are adapted to conditions that we might see in the future. And then just one other thing that I thought was a discussion is prescribed burning, reducing wildfires tending to be higher severity. And that's another, I think, a real big challenge will be trying to maintain older communities. So, forests with some old growth structure that takes time to develop. And if, things are really changing, there's going to be less and less of that on the landscape. So the more that we can create landscapes that are less likely to burn at high severity and turn over rapidly, but retain more of those legacy individual trees or forests or whatever else is probably a good thing, and reducing fuels and prescribed burning probably will help that.
Yeah, I agree with what Will said. I can provide a few examples of some of the work I've done with the Park Service and LAD Foundation out in Missouri. They received a Wildlife Conservation Society adaptation grant several years ago, and a lot of that focused on restoring fire to the landscape as an adaptation strategy. So one part of that was that the model projections for tree habitat suitability suggested that shortleaf pine would increase in habitat suitability in parts of Missouri. And in order to establish shortleaf pine on the landscape, you need fire. And so that was one piece of some of the management that they were doing. Another piece were these glade ecosystems that they have. that have a lot of, like Will mentioned, these more xeric species that are more commonly found in the Southwest. And so they've been like hanging out on these exposed hills, and they could have an opportunity to expand on the landscape if things get a lot hotter or drier in the summer. And so to help promote that flora, incorporating prescribed burning and reducing the component of juniper that's kind of been proliferating on the landscape was a really important adaptation tool for that location. So I see prescribed fire as being a really important component of adaptation, and obviously there are some emissions associated with prescribed fire, but if these are low intensity burns, those emissions are very small.
Yeah, and I'd like to jump back in as well, and just mention that and this is where I put in a plug for monitoring. That's the big part of what I do, and watching. I've been studying and doing long-term monitoring of prescribed burning, both in Missouri and in throughout the Midwest and Southeast for the last 20 years, and it's possible for me to say that I've seen changes in how conditions during the spring burn season have changed over time, and how things are burning a little bit differently. And it's difficult of course for me to attribute that to climate change, but you can certainly see if the trends that are predicted continue, that these are the things we'll see more of. And I think it's really important for us, and this incorporates the planning aspect as well, is to acknowledge that prescribed burning may at some point produce unintended consequences, that we need to be watchful for that as well. And not only for smoke emissions and impacts that exacerbate climate change or human health, but also for just vegetation changes and things that would potentially move us the wrong direction with meeting our long-term goals and objectives. And I think so that's where I think it's really important to have some kind of monitoring in place to watch, to be able to assess, what's happening on those landscapes that we're burning. It doesn't have to be a real formal or elaborate monitoring scheme, but just to be able to say that you're not having those unintended consequences.
Yeah, I know. In our first, I think it was our fire history panel, Melissa Thomas Van Gundy, and I've heard her say this a few times. She says, fire is it's never the silver bullet. It's not going to fix everything, but it's just restoring that process to the land and to our ecosystems can really help them with their own resilience and getting those communities back on track in some cases. And actually, if I can go into this point, we've heard a lot this year because of the wildfires out west, which I know is not necessarily the region that you all are focused in. But we've heard a lot this year about this sort of the interplay between 100 years of fire suppression that we talk about a lot. We're still coming out of this era of fire suppression and climate change versus forest management in terms of reducing fuels and protecting citizens from damage that could be caused by wildfire. And so I'm curious where you all come down on that point. Should we be focusing more on climate change? Should we be focusing on different types of forest management? Should we be accounting for these 100 years of fire suppression? What's the biggest factor in your work? Or if someone, because it always comes down to a game of resources versus, I see Leslie doing this, all of it. Yeah, but it does, it comes down to a game of resources and time and goals, right? So in your specific zone, what do you place first? I know it's a tough question.
Well, I should speak to that. The first objective that we all need to have is it's public safety, and I think that's the most important part of it. We're still really struggling with the information to try to figure out what the best path forward is in a lot of cases. But that's the part we need to keep our eye on, is what do we need to do to promote public safety. That's our first. That should be the first objective for any land manager. Beyond that, I think we all have slightly different goals, and those all add to the complexity of how we choose our management actions and how we decide to move forward. But I think that's what we need to keep our eye on first, and we're gonna, over time, the hope, I think, is that the picture starts to become a little bit clearer about how we need to balance all of those different pieces. And of course, the sweet spot is where we can achieve multiple objectives at the same time. And I think we have some good examples of that on a lot of landscapes where we're reducing the risk of fire and maintaining and restoring landscapes, reducing fuels, building resilient landscapes, as Will talked about. So I think that's kind of the sweet spot, and that's the thing we should be looking for, is the places where we can achieve all of those objectives.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to jump on it? Leslie, do you want to emphasize all of it?
I mean, yeah, I think we really need to focus on areas where there are mutual co-benefits to decisions that we make, and prioritize those things first. And then when there are trade-offs where, one decision that would boost something in one direction might negatively affect another, that's where we need to step back and reconsider and think about it more. So, but I think there are so many things that we can do that are going to achieve multiple objectives that we can start there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. So we are getting up to 1 o'clock here. I'd like to touch on some of the questions from the people who are attending and putting questions, because I know this chat has been just going crazy. So Andrea, if you're there, would you jump in with a question from our chat box?
Yeah. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. I'll start with a couple of questions that were somewhat similar that Becky and Lindsay had asked, and it was about either sources to point to or models that the panelists recommend for looking at the link between prescribed fire and carbon sequestration in the long term. I know, Aaron, you had mentioned that. So if there's some sources that you could point to, and then as far as some models for illustrating emissions for prescribed fire in the NEPA process specifically. So those are somewhat similar in nature. So Aaron or others, would you mind taking that on?
I can start. I'm sure others can join in. We do have a list of tools for carbon inventory and reporting on the U.S. Forest Service site from the Northern Research Station. I think you mentioned the one that I would have recommended, which is the Carbon Online Estimator, or COAL. There's a few others too that I haven't fully explored, but I think could apply to this situation. One of the things when we're talking about carbon sequestration is quantification and verification. And oftentimes for the NEPA reports, the best we can do is estimate and use models. But one other thing I wanted to make sure everybody remembers is that it's happening. Carbon sequestration happens above ground and below ground.
Yeah, for NEPA, what we've been encouraging people in the National Forest System to do is use a consistent set of qualitative analyses that were developed as a pilot on a few of our national forests, including the Green Mountain National Forest in our region. And what that does is provide a discussion of kind of how much carbon is stored on your national forest, a discussion on sort of the appropriate scale of analysis, and then kind of the magnitude of the impact your project might have on carbon emissions. And what that does is help people put things in a broader context where it doesn't make sense to quantify things at a stand level for looking at carbon emissions, and that we need to be thinking at a regional or global scale because carbon is emitted into the atmosphere globally. And so that approach has worked really well. And there are times when we do need to quantify carbon emissions, but I think at some scales we just don't have the level of precision necessary to really quantify those emissions, and so it just doesn't make sense at certain scales.
So I'll jump in and thinking about models, tools, and then also scientific literature, and I guess also a little bit building on the scale that Leslie was talking about. And so the model that I've worked with primarily is called Landis, and there are other models, FireBGC, that academics and managers are working with, and scientists that take quite a bit of background to get up and going and working with the models, but they're being applied in the southeast and the eastern forest more. They kind of started more in the, I guess, the Lake States region. They've been applied quite a bit there. So I think those are tools that you can look at. Like Rob Scheller is someone, I don't have specific papers right now to give you, but Rob Scheller's worked quite a bit. Louise Loudermilk in the southeast, and Matt Hertaw has done some stuff, and so those are people maybe to look at. That's a landscape scale model. So if you're looking at like a particular stand that you're kind of interested in, I guess for NEPA, that's not going to provide you with specific numbers. But again, looking at these models in terms of general directions and what you might expect in terms of prescribed burning versus wildfire versus no fire at a landscape scale, how that might affect carbon emissions and sequestration. And then one, I guess at a finer scale, I haven't used it for carbon, but climate FVS. So I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with FVS. Climate FVS allows you to use some climate scenarios to look at really kind of the stand scale and look at changes in carbon. And so again, that might be one tool. And again, sort of seeing a range of potential outcomes and general trends.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for providing some of those examples. We will have, I know there's a lot of links that are being referenced and tools that are being referenced. We will have all of those tools and links will be up on the Northern Research Station website along with a recording of this. And I'll throw a link into the chat window in just 1 second. But if I may, there was a couple other questions that were asked that I thought were pretty good that I'd love to kick to the panelists. One that a gentleman named Chris asked, he said, well, it's a two-part question. One is, what about shifts in safe prescribed fire weather, either more or less shifts in season? So I think that would be a really good one for us to discuss. And then Chris also mentioned that most of the discussion today has been about ecological fire effects. But what about equipment and training that's needed for staff? So it'd be great if we could discuss those two questions as well.
Well, I can talk a little bit about this changing seasonality of prescribed burning. I think that's a place where we're not quite there, at least where I work. Other folks may be looking at that. Historically we've always been looking for more opportunities to burn to increase the window. I mean, just in a general sense. But looking at, do we need to start to avoid certain times of year or certain types of burning conditions is a really good point. I don't think we're quite there yet. I don't think we're looking at that. I don't think we understand enough of how to do that yet. And I think there's also a lot of inertia from the way we've done in the past that is going to make that difficult to do. All of our hiring and training and everything is predicated on a particular fire season. And so that doesn't mean that can't or shouldn't change. It just means that that's going to pose an additional challenge. And I don't think that's a great question, because I don't think that's something that we really, started to really grapple with fully yet. Is how does this change our timing? How does this change our the needs for when we bring people on and when we try to schedule some things? And I don't know if I can speak as well to the equipment question, so I might leave that to someone else. But with training, that may be a thing too, where that's gonna be a challenge for us to kind of alter timing as new fire seasons and new fire windows for prescribed burning start to be used. But I'll stop there. Let somebody else jump in.
Yeah, I think Rob, you raise a lot of good points, and we have started to have conversations about shifting seasonality of burning to perhaps the fall or winter, but then there are considerations of how that might differentially affect your outcomes on the ground. So that's something that people are going to need to be thinking about. I think another consideration is that as the fire season out west comes earlier and expands later, and a lot of the staff that do prescribed fire in the east also will go on fire assignment out west, we might have reduced staffing capacity to do prescribed fire in the east. So that would be another thing that we need to be thinking about a little bit more.
I'll jump in and so I'm going to bring in both modeling and tree rings to this comment. So one, I put in the chat window paper that I just came across in thinking about this panel from John Kupfer and some other authors looking at it's a modeling exercise looking at and projecting a reduced prescribed burning opportunities in the Southeast under different climate change projections. So that's one piece of literature to look at. And they are basically saying that, warmer temperatures in the summertime are going to reduce the number of days that are safe for burning and probably push it towards burning opportunities in the dormant season potentially. And then, so the other piece of that, the tree ring piece is that, so the historical fire record in the Eastern US, almost everywhere that people have done fire history studies, they find dominance of dormant season burns. So the scars are occurring on the boundary between the one annual ring and the next annual ring. So sometime outside of the growing season. And that goes back through, the Euro-American settlement, and then in most places into the pre-Euro-American settlement period. And so when I think about that, I know that managers are often interested in burning in the growing season. Climate change may push things the burning window away from the growing season, but I think that historical record suggests that ecological objectives can potentially be achieved by burning during the dormant season if again, looking at what was produced during those different periods. But there's been a lot of dormant season burning historically in the Eastern US. That I know, and I'll just say one caveat, that's mostly in upland areas where fire scar stuff has been available. I think things may differ in longleaf systems, and obviously there's a lot of variability, but that's kind of my piece on seasonality.
That flows well into what I was going to say, which is, we very much in New England have a bimodal fire season, especially for prescribed fires. And I work a lot with farmers, and we talk about one of the opportunities of climate change is longer growing seasons. And I feel like that translates to be a disadvantage for prescribed burn managers who have trouble burning during the growing season, and our dormant seasons are getting where we actually have fuel available for burning are getting smaller. And what we're seeing in the Northeast is wetter springs, which is well documented, and that's a critical time for burning. And then we're also seeing sometimes wetter falls or sometimes too dry falls, so that pushes us out of our burn windows that way too. So I definitely see these challenges specific to climate change.
That flows perfectly well into one of the other questions that we had, which we've sort of touched on, but I want to ask it in case there's some more conversation around it, which is, what do we do when we have when there's no past or nearby analog of climate regimes? So when we are seeing climate being shifted so far away from this natural range of variability, where we have such a strong wet, dry season. So can we talk about that a little bit more? Don't everybody jump at
Yeah,
once.
I mean, I think we don't know what we should do. And that's why I think it's going to take people trying things and learning, practicing adaptive management, doing applied research, monitoring. All of that is going to help us inform what decisions we might make. And I wish we had answers of like, this is what we should do, but I think it's going to be so location specific, and we're going to have to constantly adapt as weather conditions change and the climate changes more rapidly than we are used to. So I wish I had answers, but I don't think I do.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Nobody really jumped in right away. It's hard. It's uncertainty. There's a great deal of uncertainty. One thing that I think about, and this is, just sort of like, this is like an informal conversation, right? And so I don't have research to back this up or modeling, but in terms of thinking about ways to approach, often there's like a discussion of approaches that are resistance-based versus reorganization, like the R's, and then in the middle of that you can have resilience. But those two, and so one is basically trying to promote what you have there, right, and resist change, and then the other is trying to encourage reorganization. And so that might be like planting new species and all the stuff that we're like, really uncertain about, and or burning outside of typical seasons, or and so I think one way, like small experiments and mixing those two approaches in a landscape is one way to think about it, because then you have sort of a diversity of habitat types, you have a diversity of species, and you're more likely to hit on something that is going to do well in those future conditions. And if the whole landscape does turn over, then you've got some species established for that reorganization. If it's less drastic change, you have some of those legacy communities that can continue to survive in sort of refugia on the landscape. But I think, again, that mix, and now I know that may not be feasible for many managers and different organizations at this point, but I think it's one thing to kind of think about, and something that could be modeled, or that more importantly managers could start to test out a little bit.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Andrea, for pulling those questions, and thank you all of you for all of our audience for submitting these questions, and all of the chat going on the side. I'm seeing some little collaborations maybe pop up right here. So for the next little segment, I want to talk about communication a bit. That's my area. That's something that I'm especially interested in. And I noticed this past year, especially, that we were seeing the message of climate change tied really closely with wildfire. And part of that's intentional, right? Public information officers that go out to wildfires, national level and state level wildfires, they get key messages, and that's one of the ones that was included on the list this year. And I'm curious if one of you, or maybe each of you, or a few of you, can share a story about how you combine those messages. How do you talk about fire to the public or to your partners or within your organization in the realm of climate change? Do you use fire to open up for climate change, or do you discuss climate change by talking about fire management needs? Or maybe you can share a success story, or maybe we call lessons learned, basically a failure story when it didn't work out so well. Just feel free to jump in when something pops up at you.
I have a quick fun story, which is that this fall, when wildfires were pretty active out west, I and many of my colleagues were contacted by the media, and they really, really wanted us to say that climate change was going to cause intense fire in the Northeast. And they called around until they found somebody who would say that. So I would say the general feeling from most of us is that we don't have that kind of certainty. But I do think that there is a pressure for stating that, or for kind of heading in that direction.
So they didn't think that you guys all talked to each other, that you would compare notes. See, that's another benefit of collaboration. You can you can protect each other. Anybody else?
I think in a lot of places in the Midwest and Northeast, people are not really concerned about wildfire. And so we usually start the conversation around whatever they are concerned about. And oftentimes what people are seeing are these precipitation changes, more heavy rain events, increases in flooding. And so getting people to also even start to think about the possibility that maybe under different conditions we might have wildfire concerns in some locations is a conversation that we start having. And right now there is a lot of variation in the model projections in our region. There's some locations like northern Minnesota, like western Missouri, where some of the models are suggesting, some increased risk. But again, it really depends on the model. But just starting where people are at and what they care about is, I think, a really good way of opening that dialogue around climate change. So out west, yes, wildfires are front and center. It's impacting people's lives. That's not really necessarily the case where I sit in St. Paul, where people are along the Mississippi River and noticing they can't access their favorite trails in the spring anymore because it's so flooded. So where you are matters.
Great. Yeah. And I mean, that gets to that core communication value of thinking about your audience, right? So if we could shift gears a little bit, I want to ask each of you, and it's another sort of open-ended question. What is a puzzle that you're working on right now? If you could just share, be a little bit open. Rob's like, which one? I'm thinking from your facial expression, but what's something that you're working on right now in terms of fire and climate change? And if you can highlight any collaborative efforts, talk about who you're working with, just to give people an idea of what's going on, at the edge of research and management right now.
I'll start, but I don't really have a great example of what's going on at the edge of research and management. I'm not involved in any particular research projects. I can talk a little bit about what's going on in the National Park Service and what we're trying to do with climate change. Just this year, or early in 2020, the National Office of the Park Service put out a 5-year strategic plan, and with a goal of, as they termed it, keeping up with climate change. And I think the goal, that top-down approach, is to try to strategize and come up with ways to incorporate monitoring, research into making better planning and fire management, sort of decisions. And so that's where the Park Service is right now, and that's really sort of at the beginning is how I would characterize that. We know that there are these changes going on, across the country, but we haven't quite cracked that puzzle of how you incorporate that into that planning, the planning side of that. And I think that's what we're starting to work on right now. And so those efforts are underway. We have a work group, and we've started by interviewing a number of peak managers to try to get a sense of where folks are on the ground. And this is more from the management side of things. We want to get an idea, pulse check of where folks are and what kind of information that they think they need, and then try to figure out how to make that happen by working with researchers. So I think, again, we're at the very beginning stages of that. So I can't really tout any real successes other than the fact that it's ongoing. And I think that's a sign of the times that fits into this story.
Thank you. Anybody else want to go next?
So my work with fire and climate change has specifically climate change, and looking forward, has mostly been in the Western U.S. And I'm moving into that in the Eastern U.S. But I guess so. Examples that I will say for kind of questions and research directions are, and we've sort of been talking about this, but using modeling tools to test out some of these strategies that we've come up with by working with managers in different landscapes. And so whether that is so for example, maybe in some places in the Western US, reducing the frequency of prescribed burning as things start to dry out and in those less productive forests, or doing planting in some areas and seeing if that speeds up recovery if you're taking some lower elevation species and starting to plant them. And then I guess the one really big challenge for that is thinking about genetic differences and how that may come into play, rather than just thinking about species, but collecting seeds from different areas and how that might influence species' abilities to respond to different climate futures. And and that's a big challenge, and there's a lot to figure out about that. So I think that's something interesting. And I guess I'll go back to just saying that in terms of managers have been really essential in all of these different landscapes in terms of understanding what their questions are and challenges are, and what's the most effective kind of approaches to test in a particular landscape.
Sounds very interesting. I'm curious how that's going to turn out. So please keep us updated. Erin.
We've had an influx of interest in climate change over the last couple of years, and I expect even more so as our administration changes and the government starts shifting their focus. We also in our region have quite a bit of expertise in fire. We have managers that have stuck around for a long time and have that institutional knowledge of being on the ground. And there's some fresh energy for fire research as well. And the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange really tries to bring all of these people together and stay up to date on who's working on fire in our region. So connecting with us would be fantastic. And the other fire exchanges as well are doing the same sorts of things, depending on where you are on the map. And tying those new folks to existing projects and letting them know about kind of the history of the collaborations in our region has really helped kind of snowball efforts. So that's kind of what we currently are trying to do is harness some of the new folks. When we first started our fire exchange about 7 years ago, there was very few folks working in the university setting in our region for fire research, and now we have several.
Okay.
Yeah, Leslie.
I guess I'm left, huh? A couple of things going on. One is this fire menu that Will and I have talked about a bunch. So we're hoping to get that published and out and available. So I think that is an exciting thing that we're working on. A report is also forthcoming from the Forest Service R&D on climate change and the wildland-urban interface. And there will be a chapter on fire in there, as well as other chapters on wildlife and vegetation. And I've been involved in that. And so I think that could be a good source of information for people who are working in those systems. And then I think another area of research that's really exciting is the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change program, that network of research projects that's being started across the United States. There's one site on the Chippewa National Forest. There's one at Second College Grant in Vermont. We have an urban site here in St. Paul, and then there are others all over the country. And those are kind of testing these different climate change adaptation strategies to deal with on that spectrum of resisting change versus building resilience versus transitioning towards future conditions. And some of those are also incorporating ideas like prescribed fire. So I think that experimental framework would be really useful, and it would be great to think more about how we could apply those ideas more in more fire adapted ecosystems.
Thank you all for sharing your puzzles with us. I always find it interesting to hear what other people are grappling with, because it always gives you ideas about how you can collaborate, how you can reach out. And so we have just a few minutes left. It's 1:20, believe it or not. We've almost passed our whole time. I told you all, we had a little dress rehearsal for the audience, and I told them all it will go so much faster than you can imagine. And so in these last few minutes, if you can, I'd like you to think through what's your take-home point for people watching today, for your region or for your work, or like, what is the one thing you want them to take home and talk about at dinner or tell their mom? What, if we're lucky, like what's the one thing about fire and climate change that they can take home?
I'll start. My takeaway for folks is not to let this sort of become a spectator sport of waiting for scientists to tell us the answers, especially for folks who are land managers. We have a real responsibility to keep good records. I think anybody who works in fire management has the responsibility of recording all fires, locations, size, information about that fire, and also weather, our local weather. We, at least federal land managers, we have weather stations where we collect local weather data. And I think the point of that is simply that we can't really understand how things are changing unless we know what's happened in the past and what's happening today. So I think it's really important to shore up any efforts that we have to keep good records right now. Any research about climate change effects on fire are going to be dependent on having good records for where fires have occurred, what the severity of those fires has been, what the weather conditions were like locally when those things happened. And I think that's a challenge for all of us who manage fire on the landscape to start to keep better records so that we can make those comparisons in the future. And also to shore up any records we have from the past. A lot of those records are really in poor condition, frankly, and they all require a lot of work to get them back into usable shape so that they're more accurate and usable. So that's a plug for everybody to kind of do their part.
Wow, yeah, don't let it be a spectator sport. I feel like that's going to be something that I hold on to for a long time, and that I repeat, by the way. Will, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with that, Rob, and I guess I would say building on that, one would be, despite we've talked about all this uncertainty, but not to despair, and to I think think creatively, right? And so certainly in terms of your conversations, and where you're looking for information. And I know it's easy for me to say experiment and be creative when I'm working in a model format, right? And you're dealing with actual landscapes that you don't want to make a mistake with. But I think that is going to be important, to be flexible and thinking creatively. And then I'll say one other quick thing that I didn't mention before, but my cooperators would be upset with me if I didn't mention a couple tools from the fire climb. One is a vulnerability tool from that project, that I just put a link to it in the chat, and it's a spreadsheet just through discussions with managers. We developed on the Southwest, but it could be applied anywhere. And it's a way to try and start assessing what components of your landscape might be vulnerable in terms of fire, climate change, and ecological outcomes. And then we also have an annotated bibliography that you can search different sort of keywords of 190 papers, again, in the Southwest. That's where it's focused, but that's the type of thing that could be developed and really useful in many different areas.
Thank you. Leslie, if you can, in 2 minutes or less.
Okay. I would say that you don't have to go it alone. There are so many people out there that are thinking through these ideas, that are willing to collaborate with you and provide resources that, if you're interested in exploring climate change impacts or adapting your project to climate change, you can reach out to people like us at NIAX, and we're happy to provide you with lots of information. We have free trainings available, so feel free to sign up for those. We have an online workbook for adaptation that you can use, totally free as well. And so lots of stuff out there, and I know it can be overwhelming. So if you just need like a person, you can start with me and I can help direct you to the right person, to help you walk through it all.
Yeah, and just, you can also always reach out to your fire science exchange. I'll put, or maybe someone can put that link in the box. We know all the best people, y'all. We do. Erin, your take home point, please.
Sure, I have a fun one. As fire managers and scientists, I know you pay attention to drought, and now we have a little bit of a paradoxical situation where we're getting more precipitation, but also more drought or periods in between the precipitation. And that, of course, matters a lot for fire. And I encourage you to pay attention to new drought tools that are coming out and watch evaporative demand and how vapor pressure deficit is affecting our soils and our plants, because it's really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, why wouldn't your take home point about climate change be a fun one? See, it's not all doom and gloom. Okay, so we have to wrap up here. I just want to say again, it's been an honor and a joy to sit here with the four of you today. And I feel like I've learned a ton. There's 1,000 resources in this chat box. And it's just been really wonderful. So thank you all. And we can't, do a virtual applause because everybody's muted, but just know that we're all applauding you with our hearts. And with that, I'll kick it over to Andrea if you want to take us home.
Sure, yeah. Let's just make sure that folks can see my desktop. So again, Aaron, Rob, Leslie, Will, thank you so much. Jen, you did an awesome job moderating this discussion. Everyone who joined us today, thank you so much for joining us. And we hope you'll come back. Our next panel discussion is scheduled for February 18th, same time, same place. And we will be...
Different link.
Pardon?
It will be a different link. Just want to throw that out there.
Different link. Yes, you're right. Same time, same place in your own home. And our discussion will be moderated by Joe Marshall, and we have a great line of panelists set up, and we'll be talking about timber management and prescribed fire. So we hope you'll join us for that discussion. That's a wrap. Thank you again, everyone, for participating today. We really appreciate it.